All right, so we're diving into something a little different this time.
Yeah.
You guys know, how much we love to go deep. And you guys pointed us towards The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck
Yeah.
by Mark Manson.
Awesome
So
choice.
we've got, I think we have 3 excerpts from this.
Yes.
And the goal here, as always, is to kind of, go through this material and pull out what's truly useful.
Yep.
The stuff that can actually give you a fresh perspective.
Exactly.
And help you, see things in a different light without being overwhelming, rather.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's right.
So what's interesting about this book, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have probably read it, is that it's kind of like a self-help, but
It's self-help,
not really.
but it's not your typical self-help book, is it?
Yeah, it's not.
It kind of flips the script on a lot of the traditional self-help advice.
Yeah.
And instead of, I guess, telling you to constantly be positive or,
Right.
kind of relentlessly pursue happiness, it actually argues that might be counterproductive.
Right. Okay. So let's jump into that.
Yeah.
What's the core idea that Manson's getting at when he's talking about this obsession with positive thinking, right?
Okay. So he introduces this idea of what he calls the feedback loop from hell.
Okay.
And I think everyone listening can probably relate to this in some way. It's like, when you feel anxious, you then get anxious about feeling anxious.
Yeah.
Or you get angry, and then you get frustrated with yourself for being angry.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like this snowball effect of negativity,
Totally. So it's like you're not only dealing with the initial, bad feeling.
Yeah.
It's the fact that you're, beating yourself up over it.
Yeah, you're adding a layer of judgment on top of it.
Right.
Which just amplifies the initial feeling.
Yeah. So how do we, break out of that? How does not giving effect, how does that actually, play into this?
Well, what he's saying is that by choosing not to focus on the fact that you feel bad,
Right.
you can actually interrupt that cycle.
Oh, okay.
So it's about acknowledging the emotion. Like, okay, I'm feeling anxious right now, or I'm frustrated.
Right.
But without immediately kind of layering on that second level of worry or self-criticism.
Got it.
It's acceptance without the escalation. So the next time you notice yourself, getting anxious about being anxious, try just kind of acknowledging that initial feeling without judgment and see if that helps to kind of disrupt that spiral.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. I think that's really interesting. But I mean, not giving effect kind of sounds like, to some people it sounds like, apathy, right? Right? Yeah. Like not caring about anything.
Yeah. It can be misinterpreted.
Is that really what he's getting at?
No, not at all. And he clarifies that, it's a very nuanced concept.
Okay.
So it's not about just being indifferent to everything.
Right.
It's more about consciously choosing what you decide to direct your attention and care towards.
Got it.
And those decisions should be based on what truly matters to you, your values.
Got it.
So it's a practice in choosing your values, really. What do I genuinely care about, and therefore what do I choose not to care about so much?
Right.
It's selective.
So it's a selective process, right? You can't just shut off all your emotions.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, that's not going to work. He also mentions this he calls it subtlety #2.
Yes.
And it's about adversity, right? Dealing with tough times.
Yeah, how to deal with adversity effectively.
What's the key takeaway from that?
So he's saying that to effectively not give a fuck about the tough times,
Right.
you actually have to give a fuck about something
Okay.
that's more important than those difficulties.
Okay.
And he uses this pretty memorable example of this elderly woman
Okay.
who gets really upset over losing a small coupon.
Oh, okay.
And, from the outside looking in, it might seem kind of, trivial.
Yeah.
But Manson suggests that maybe for her, those coupons represent one of the few things in her life where she feels a sense of control.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So all her focus and care is kind of directed towards these small tokens because they represent something bigger.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it kind of highlights that, when you have something meaningful to focus on, it can really put the smaller frustrations into perspective.
Right. So it's not really about the coupons themselves. It's about what they represent for her.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. He also talks about maturity in
Right.
relation to this, right?
Mhm.
Like, how does getting older, how does that play into, what we give a feck about?
He suggests that maturity is a natural process of becoming more discerning about what really deserves our attention and energy.
Like a,
So as we gain more life experience, we start to realize that a lot of the things we used to stress over, they actually didn't really have that much of a lasting impact.
yeah, yeah.
So we kind of learn to reserve our mental and emotional resources
Right.
for the people, relationships, and pursuits that genuinely align with our values.
Okay, so, if we were to distill the central message of this book, right,
Yeah.
for you, the listener,
Hmm.
what would you say is like the most important thing that Manson wants you to take away from this?
Well, I'd say that his core aim is to encourage you to think more deliberately
Okay.
about what you're choosing to value
Yeah.
and what you're allowing to kind of occupy your mental space.
Yeah, okay.
He believes that a big problem people face these days is this feeling that, it's not okay for things to suck sometimes.
Yeah.
That it's somehow wrong or unacceptable for things to be difficult or unpleasant.
Right.
And I think this leads to all sorts of, unhelpful ways of coping.
It's almost like we've been trained to think that life should just be this constant highlight reel, right?
Exactly.
And when it's not, we feel like something's wrong.
Yeah, and then we kind of freak out and try to fix it when sometimes it's just life.
Yeah. So what's the alternative?
Well, he advocates for what he calls a practical enlightenment.
Okay.
And this isn't about achieving some, unattainable state of bliss.
Yeah.
It's more about developing a comfortable acceptance of the fact that suffering is just an inevitable part of life,
Yeah.
Whether that's through failures or loss or disappointments.
Right.
He's basically saying that the only way to overcome pain is to develop the capacity to bear it.
Okay. It kind of sounds a little bit stark.
Yeah, it's not always easy to hear,
Right.
but there's the truth to it, isn't there?
I guess, yeah. He also brings up the Buddha.
Yeah.
And this idea of a disappointment panda.
Uh,
How do those fit into all this?
so one of the Buddha's kind of foundational teachings is that life inherently involves suffering.
Okay.
And Manson kind of echoes this sentiment with his disappointment panda analogy, which, you can think of as this, like a messenger of sorts.
Okay.
That delivers these often unwelcome but necessary truths about, life's difficulties.
Right. Right.
He's trying to get us to see that problems aren't like anomalies.
Yeah.
They're actually a fundamental aspect of the human experience.
Okay. And he takes this idea even further, right? He says the solution to one problem is merely the creation of the next one.
Right.
That's not exactly a cheery thought.
No, it's not, is it?
Right.
But I think his point is that we shouldn't be aiming for this problem-free existence
Yeah.
because that's just not realistic.
Right.
Instead, we should aspire to have good problems.
Okay. What are good problems?
These are challenges that we have the capacity to address,
Mm-hmm.
that align with our values and contribute to our growth.
Right. So it's not the absence of problems, it's having the right problem.
Yeah, exactly. The problems that push us to become better versions of ourselves.
So happiness isn't the absence of problems then, it's how we deal with the problems that we have.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
He argues that happiness isn't this passive state you just arrive at.
Right.
It's an active process of tackling and solving problems.
Okay.
So trying to avoid problems altogether will actually lead to dissatisfaction in the long run.
Got it.
The sense of fulfillment, he says, comes from the very act of overcoming challenges.
Right. So it's the process of solving the problem
Exactly, yeah.
that leads to happiness.
Yep.
He also presents negative emotions as these calls to action.
Yeah,
Right. That's kind of an interesting way to look at it.
it is. He suggests that those feelings of being down or frustrated or whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
they're actually signals that something needs your attention, that there's an issue that needs to be addressed,
Right.
and that positive emotions, they're kind of like the reward for taking constructive action.
Okay. Okay.
So it's not about ignoring or suppressing those negative feelings,
Yeah.
but understanding what they might be trying to tell you.
Right.
He cautions against blindly following every emotional impulse, obviously.
Yeah.
But he encourages you to question those feelings and see what's behind them.
Okay.
Because he believes that suppressing those negative emotions can actually hinder your ability to solve problems and ultimately lead to less happiness.
So it's not about being happy all the time. It's about like understanding what those negative emotions are trying to tell you.
Yeah, exactly. It's about using them as information to guide your actions.
So, I mean, it sounds like, Manson is saying that everything in life kind of has this trade-off, right? It's
Yeah.
like he even says everything comes with sacrifice.
Yeah, that's a pretty core principle for him.
Right.
It's the idea that whatever brings us joy or satisfaction, it's also inevitably going to involve some kind of discomfort or drawback.
Mm-hmm.
What we gain in one area, we often give up in another.
Right, yeah.
So true happiness and fulfillment aren't really about avoiding the negative altogether.
Okay.
It's about choosing which negative experiences you're willing to tolerate.
Okay.
For the sake of something that you deeply value.
So it's not really about like what you desire. It's more about what you're willing to like suffer through to get there.
Yeah, exactly. It's about asking yourself, what kind of discomfort am I willing to endure to achieve what I truly value?
So the question isn't what do I want? It's what pain am I willing to go through?
Yeah, that's a much more powerful question, isn't it?
Right. And he gives this example of his own ambition, like when he wanted to be a rock star.
Yeah.
Right? He was drawn to like the idea of fame, of performing.
Result, yeah.
But he wasn't willing to do all the stuff.
Yeah, he wasn't willing to embrace the process.
Right.
The relentless practice, the logistics, the rejections. He wanted the reward without the necessary struggle.
He wanted to skip all the hard stuff.
Exactly.
Right. And he even concludes by saying that, who you are is defined by what you're willing to struggle for.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And then he moves on to like the dangers of just focusing on positivity, right? Like just being positive all the time, but not actually like doing anything.
Yeah, he uses this example of a guy he calls Jimmy.
Yeah, Jimmy.
Who's kind of this perpetually optimistic guy.
Yeah.
Full of grand plans, but never really seems to get anything done.
Right.
He has this unwavering self-confidence, but it's kind of delusional.
So it's like he thinks he can just like will things into existence just by like being positive about it.
Yeah, he expects positive outcomes without any real investment.
So it's kind of like, it's almost like entitlement then.
Exactly. That's exactly what Manson is getting at. He argues that sometimes, even the self-esteem movement maybe inadvertently fostered this kind of thinking.
Oh, okay.
By emphasizing feeling good about yourself regardless of your actual accomplishments or character.
So it's like it's not enough to just feel good about yourself. You have to actually like do something.
Right. You have to earn it.
Right. Okay. And Manson argues that this sense of entitlement, it actually gets in the way of like personal growth.
Absolutely.
Right, because you're not really like honestly assessing yourself.
Yeah, you're not willing to look at your own shortcomings.
Right.
And therefore, you're not able to improve.
Okay. And he brings up this story about himself, right? About being wrongly accused of something.
Mm-hmm. Back when he was in school,
yeah,
he was wrongly accused of bringing drugs to school.
Yeah. So how does that like play into this idea of entitlement?
I think it highlights how frustrating it can be when you're faced with, baseless accusations.
Mm-hmm.
And this natural human tendency we have to deny wrongdoing, even when we're innocent.
Mm-hmm.
In his story, the principal was so convinced of Manson's guilt that he completely dismissed his explanations.
Right.
And I think it's a small-scale example of how a fixed mindset, can override objective reality.
Right.
And how difficult it can be to admit when we might be wrong, which is so crucial for personal growth.
So it's like you got to be willing to say, hey, I might have screwed up here.
Yeah, we have to be open to the possibility that we're not always right.
Okay, I get it. And then he kind of connects this entitlement thing to his own like relationship pattern.
Yes.
Like
he talks about how, he realized that some of his unresolved pain from his younger years was actually leading him to seek constant validation and reassurance in his romantic relationships.
Got it.
Which, of course, creates pretty unhealthy dynamics.
Right, yeah.
And he felt entitled to that constant affirmation, without necessarily giving it in return.
Yeah. So it's like he felt like he deserved to be like constantly reassured.
Yeah. And he was placing an unfair burden on his partners.
Right.
He realized that the more profound our past hurts are, the more we might unconsciously develop this sense of entitlement as a way to compensate for those feelings of vulnerability.
Okay. So it's almost like a defense mechanism then.
It can be.
Okay, that's interesting. He then goes on to talk about like the internet and social media, right?
Yeah.
And he suggests that they might be contributing to this whole entitlement problem.
It's an interesting point. He proposes that the constant exposure to these, highly curated and often exceptional portrayals of life online, it can create this distorted sense of what's normal or achievable.
Yeah.
Leading to feelings of inadequacy in our own lives.
Right.
And maybe even this subconscious belief that we deserve more of that exceptionalism without necessarily putting in the work to achieve it.
So it's almost like social media makes us feel like we're not good enough.
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it sets up these unrealistic expectations.
And then we feel entitled to like have those things without actually having to do anything for it.
Right. Because we see other people seemingly having it so easily.
Yeah, okay. And he even comes up with this term for it, right? He calls it the tyranny of exceptionalism.
Yeah. It's a pretty evocative term.
It is, yeah.
It's basically saying that this constant exposure to, extraordinary achievements and lifestyles, it can create this illusion that being exceptional is like the norm.
Right.
Which, obviously creates a problem because most of us are average in many areas.
Yeah.
So this constant comparison can fuel insecurity and a sense of entitlement and even lead to addictive behaviors.
Wow. Okay. So this desire to be special, right, and this difficulty in accepting reality,
right,
can lead to some pretty extreme consequences. And Manson uses this really interesting story of Hiroo Onoda, the Japanese soldier,
the soldier who kept fighting World War II long after it ended.
Right. For decades.
Yeah.
So what's the key takeaway there? Like, what are we supposed to learn from his really rigid adherence to his orders, right?
Well, I think Onoda's story is a really powerful illustration of the dangers of clinging to rigid beliefs and being unwilling to accept new information.
Okay.
Even when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
Right.
His unwavering belief in his mission, it blinded him to the reality that the war was over.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's Norio Suzuki, the adventurer who actually went and found him.
Yeah.
Well, what does his story add to all this?
So Suzuki, he had this kind of, seemingly pointless goal, right, of finding Onoda, a panda, and the Yeti.
Right.
Which, to a lot of people probably seemed kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
But in their own ways, both Onoda and Suzuki, they found a sense of purpose in their chosen paths. And neither of them expressed any regrets.
So it's like, it's about finding meaning in what you do.
Yeah, even if those pursuits might seem unconventional to others.
Right. And then we get into this discussion about metrics.
Yes.
Right? Like, it's not just about like what we value. It's also about how we measure like our progress towards those values.
Exactly. Our values, they guide us.
Right.
But the way we actually assess whether we're living in accordance with those values, it can be flawed.
Yeah.
And he gives this example of like feeling like a bad sibling because you're not in constant communication with your brother when maybe, the depth of connection and mutual respect are actually more meaningful indicators of a healthy relationship.
Right.
So, it's about asking yourself, am I using the right metrics to measure what truly matters in this area of my life?
Okay. And then he goes on to contrast Dave Mustaine.
Yeah.
From Megadeth.
Of Megadeth.
With Pete Best.
Right. The original drummer for the Beatles.
Yeah. What's the point of that?
So Mustaine, despite achieving, significant success with his own band, he harbored all this resentment towards Metallica's greater fame, and he was constantly measuring his achievements against theirs.
So it's like, even though he was successful, he wasn't happy.
Exactly. He was using the wrong metrics for success.
Okay.
Whereas Pete Best, he was initially disappointed by being dismissed from the Beatles.
Yeah.
But he eventually found contentment by shifting his focus to family.
Wow.
And a quieter life.
Okay.
So it really demonstrates the pitfalls of comparing ourselves to others.
Right.
And the importance of choosing, internal value-based metrics for success.
Yeah. How do you define success for yourself?
Right. Exactly.
It's not about what other people think.
Okay.
And then Manson points out the dangers of like overvaluing things like material wealth or always needing to be right.
Yes. He argues that prioritizing material success above everything else
Right.
can lead us to compromise on more important values,
Like what?
like honesty, compassion, integrity. We become so focused on achieving status and wealth that we lose sight of what truly matters.
Right, right.
And the desire to always be right, well, that's a losing battle.
Yeah.
Because humans are inherently fallible.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to make mistakes. We're going to be wrong sometimes.
Right.
And if our whole identity is wrapped up in being right, then we're going to have a hard time learning and growing.
Okay, so the takeaway here is to cultivate like bigger values,
Exactly.
which will then lead to like better problems.
Yes.
Right.
Better problems, more meaningful struggles.
Right. Okay.
Because that's what ultimately leads to a more fulfilling life.
And with these like better problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
He emphasizes this idea of taking responsibility.
Yes, absolutely.
And he draws this distinction between like fault
And responsibility.
Right. So his point is that, while other people or external circumstances might be to blame for a particular situation,
Okay.
we always have a degree of responsibility for how we choose to respond
Right.
and how we move forward.
Okay.
He even shares this personal experience about a breakup,
Okay.
and he realized that by focusing on blaming his partner, he was just keeping himself stuck in this negativity.
Right.
But it was when he shifted his focus to taking responsibility for his own happiness,
Mm-hmm.
that's when he started to see real personal growth.
Okay. So blaming other people just keeps you stuck.
Yeah, it doesn't get you anywhere.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
by taking responsibility for our own problems that we can actually learn and improve.
And he even like shares this really powerful story, right?
Yeah.
About a father
Mm-hmm.
who had lost his son.
That lost his son, yeah.
To really kind of drive this point home.
Yeah.
It's a very moving anecdote, and it really underscores the point that even in the most devastating circumstances, we still have a choice in how we react and what meaning we make of our experiences.
Yeah.
This father, despite his unimaginable grief, was still able to find a way to take ownership of his emotional response.
And that's really powerful.
It is.
Then he kind of goes on to talk about genetics, right? Like the circumstances that we're born into.
Mm-hmm.
And he references a documentary about teenagers
Yes.
with OCD.
With OCD, yep.
So what's he trying to say with that?
He uses OCD as an example to illustrate that, while we're not to blame for our inherent predispositions or our traumatic pasts,
Okay.
we are still responsible for how we choose to manage those challenges
Right.
and how we build a life despite them.
Okay.
The documentary showed how these teenagers, by accepting their imperfections and focusing on values beyond their struggles, were able to make real progress.
Right. So it's not about like blaming yourself for having OCD.
No, not at all.
It's about like, okay, I have this, now what am I going to do about it?
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of your situation and finding ways to move forward.
Right. Okay. But he also cautions against what he calls victimhood chic.
Yes.
Right. Particularly online.
Yeah, he suggests that the internet, especially social media, can sometimes create this environment where portraying yourself as a victim can be rewarded with attention and validation.
Oh, interesting.
And this can actually detract from addressing real issues.
Right.
And make it more difficult to identify and support those who are genuinely suffering.
So it's almost like, people are trying to like one-up each other with like, who's had it worse?
Yeah, it can become a bit of a competition, which isn't helpful for anyone.
Right. It takes away from the people who are actually like going through something.
Exactly. It can trivialize real suffering.
And this leads him to like the dangers of certainty, right?
Right.
He says certainty is the enemy of growth.
It's a great quote, and I think it's very true. When we're convinced we have all the answers, we close ourselves off to new information and different perspectives.
Right.
So he advocates for this continuous process of questioning our own beliefs and assumptions.
Okay.
He reminds us that our initial judgments about positive and negative experiences, they might not always be accurate in the long run.
Right.